Have you ever had an idea for a physical product that you just knew had the potential to change the world? Maybe it was something you dreamt up in your garage or a solution to a problem you encountered in your daily life. Whatever it was, you knew it was a winner. If only you can turn that idea into something. You are not alone. Countless entrepreneurs and innovators have stood exactly where you stand, filled with passion and drive, but unsure of where to begin. And that's where the Builder Circle comes in. My name is Sera Evciman, and I'm a mechanical engineer, hardware enthusiast, and hardware mentor. I've had the privilege of working with numerous hardware companies that are passionate about solving some of the biggest challenges in the world. And I will be your host as we explore the exciting and complex world of physical product development. All right, welcome to the Builder Circle. Today I have Ying Liu with me, and we're going to dive deep into outsourcing, manufacturing, supplier interactions, specifically overseas. And I feel like the conversation is going to be incredibly helpful for a lot of startups that are working on hardware products that are looking to outsource and how they can engage with manufacturers, with OEMs, raw material suppliers, all of the above. So I'm super excited. Thank you so much for being here, Ying. I can't wait for the conversation.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
So, Ying, could you please tell our listeners about your incredible background and why we're talking about what we're talking about today?
Okay, I'll try to keep the long story short. Hi, everyone. My name is Ying Liu. I'm the founder and CEO of BlueLake Packaging, a sustainable packaging company based in Silicon Valley. I started working on this since 3, 4 years ago when I have a wake up call just looking at piles of plastics in they call the MRF, Material Recovery Center, waiting to be landfilled somewhere in the Bay Area. So I thought like we need to do something for the products so that, in the world and also for the supply chain as well. So that's my current role. I'm sure we'll talk about sustainability at some point in this podcast.
Hmm.
But prior to that, actually, I had a stellar career with Apple. I spent 12 years with Apple, uh, basically doing a little bit everything in the worldwide operations from product operations to materials management to planning and even supplier responsibility. I was the very first expatriate from Cupertino, California, which is Apple's headquarters, to Shanghai, China. I basically single-handedly built the Apple China operations team from scratch. There was literally no employee, no office. And I built the team, I built the infrastructure like IT, HR, finance, and also ramped numerous products before I came back to Cupertino again. So that was my history with Apple. And I have always been, I felt like an entrepreneurship in my heart. And I always love to make things happen. And actually, also another entrepreneur project that I did was a software company. I did a trip itinerary planning tool for avid travelers like myself. Okay, so I think that's probably give you a brief overview of my background.
That's excellent. Being a part of the operations and manufacturing of one of the biggest inventions of the century, really, and being able to ramp that up from zero. And Apple, although had computers and such, it was still a pretty early stage at that point. And so I'm very excited to get your opinion and perspective on all that is to set up manufacturing. So to kick it off directly, I always say that when startups are thinking through the manufacturing of their product, the first question that comes about is whether it's supposed to, whether they should insource or outsource. Obviously, both have pros and cons attached to them. But I guess from your perspective, what has been your methodology in determining whether to outsource or build in-house?
Yeah, okay, yeah. Thank you for this question because I feel this is a very classic supply chain management question,
Mm.
but the answer could vary from person to person, from company to company. So let me share with you my perspective. the way how I look at this is actually, I think the answer could be very complicated. There are so many things to be taken into consideration. So, for instance, when we're talking about the stage of the company,
Mhm,
I know that this podcast is particularly focused on startups, but
mhm,
also they're sort of medium-sized company, and then there are large company like when we talk about like Apple and other companies.
mhm,
Um, so the way how I look at this is, as I said, one is really the stage of the company, how big or small the company is in terms of the resources. And then secondly is also the product assessment. It becomes a matter of how complex the product is. Sometimes there are very complex products that require a lot of resources to even prove the concept. But
mhm,
also there are products that are relatively simple to make. However, it requires a lot of attention to the quality in order to compete in the marketplace. So I feel like the product assessment is very important.
mhm,
And also the stage of the development. Normally, my view is probably look for local suppliers for very early stage in terms of concept review or concept proof of concept, but look globally or outsource to scale. And another thing, probably the fourth item on my checklist, I would say, is a team assessment. It
mm,
also depends on the skill sets and experiences because sometimes there are probably supply chain expert is already readily available and people are more familiar with the outsourcing model rather than build in-house because build
mm,
in-house requires a lot of know-how and manufacturing skills. But on the other side, there could be something easily to be built in-house where you want to maintain the IP, control the IP in-house, where
mm.
only outsource things like that's commodities, for instance. So the team assessment is also critical. And needless to say, I think at any stage of the company, any stage of the product, people are looking at a cost as well. So in terms of materials costs and manufacturing costs, even packaging, logistics, and even repairs. So there's a cost definitely be part of this considerations. Another thing I would say is schedule. So it depends on how fast you want this product to go to the market. Because if sometimes if you have the expertise, like people only make a handful of them, and
Mhm.
then it's probably easier to build it in-house because you can just purchase components and build it in-house. But if you really need tens of thousands of those in a short period of time, probably outsource will make it the scale a little bit easier. And needless to say, I think I mentioned a little bit about the sales channels. It's a matter of the fulfillment, how
Mm.
the product will be delivered to the customers. Is that consumer customers or is enterprise customers? Will that be only like one-stop shipment to our warehouse, or it would needs to be distributed all over the world? So I think that's also probably will lead to a different answer in terms of outsource or build in-house.
Oh, what a phenomenal way to start. That was an excellent answer. I think you hit the main points of, well, one, I think you gave so many metrics that people should be thinking about that in turn express how serious of a decision this is because it really impacts multiple facets of a business and the product itself. And I think one addition that I would add to your list personally would be the level of risk that the technology has potentially, and how much you want to build that core competency in understanding those risks and being able to mitigate them. And I think that actually slots right under the stage of development piece that you said, because that
Yeah.
stage of development is really important to think of because sometimes it's like insource and outsourcing decision on manufacturing it has to come after the technology development has come to some level of maturity. You don't
Mm.
wanna you definitely wanna think of it early on, but not too early where you're approaching these suppliers and you are not ready to pull the plunge.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it really becomes a matter of how much control you want to have over the supply chain. It
Mm,
becomes the IP part, like you said, I like the word maturity, how mature the technology is, because if the sort of the owner of the business, the company is not ready to even make it the first few, then how would you teach or educate your supplier to do that? So there are
exactly.
definitely a lot of sort of interactions and collaborations between the company and potentially the supplier. But on the other side, I feel like, yeah, clearly if the technology is not there, is not ready, then it will be hard or maybe set to fail if that outsource too early.
That is such an excellent point. I think one of the most important things, there's this concept where a lot of startups believe that suppliers are not on their team, or certain suppliers just really don't want to work with them because they're a startup and they come from a low leverage standpoint. Which
Mm,
to a degree this is true. For suppliers, customers they do a risk assessment or probability assessment according to what their projected and expectation of revenue is, and how willing and potential is the conversion of the customer, how possible is it that they actually pay us, and like all of those things. So there, of course, there is a little bit of bias that suppliers have towards startups, but the excellent point that you made is that looking at the maturity of your product, coming to the table to suppliers prepared and with all of your documentation and all of that, and that comes with maturity of the product, it will just lead to more successful engagements, whether it's a supplier that you are buying raw material from or a contract manufacturer that you're actually having integration efforts with. Excellent point. So I guess you mentioned also from a stage of development, maybe early on, you use local vendors because you want that quick turnaround. You want to be able to have control over, and maybe the schedule will be a little bit quicker. Costs will likely be high. And then transitioning over to potentially the global market. Could you talk us through how you would go about that, or how you would advise startups to go about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really depends. Sometimes it becomes a timing of outsource. As I said, probably the first few were maybe a few hundred, or particularly during the early stage, people want to build locally. So to have quick feedback and also quick turns and proof of concept, really discover all the issues, make design improvements. But yeah, very soon, hopefully very soon, that people start looking at, oh, they're definitely a market fit. There's interest from the potential customers. So they want to kind of order kind of PO very soon. As long as you can scale, you can make tens of thousands very soon. So people start looking at who will be our sort of the partner for manufacturing at a scale. For that, I think you're absolutely right. Like a lot of cases, the supplier will look at the startup and say, "Hey, I never heard of you before. Do you have the funding to really support the manufacturing? Will you pay me in time for all this? Or do you have the know-how and for your technology, really understand what you're doing? Is there a market for your products?" And there are so many questions from the supplier side. But
Mhm.
on the other side, I think as the business owner or the entrepreneur, I feel like it becomes a matter of when people start looking for a supplier to be partnered with for this manufacturing. The way how I look at this is, I think it becomes a matter of really what's the strength and the weakness is become assessment of the supplier. What's the strength and weakness of the supplier, and how we find this? Because a lot of times, even we're in the US and then there are vendor in, say, China, Japan, India, or Vietnam, or other places like Taiwan or Korea, it will be hard to have a face-to-face sort of sit down meeting and walk through the factories, right? How you'll be able to make assessment of the supplier. So the way how I look at this is I felt like really have the supplier give examples of what they have done in the past,
Mhm.
show what exactly they've done and how they do it. So I think that's one thing. And then secondly is equally important, I think, is the project management skill. So really
Mm,
understand who will be the team players on the supplier side, because a lot of times like the supplier will send their sales executive to talk to the company, but then the salesperson probably very good at sort of selling the bright side of the company and not
sure.
really understanding some of the other issue they encountered in the past when they execute some of the product. I feel like the project management, it will be really important, I would say, to really understand their project management process and who will be the players on the team and how they do about it. So I think that's super important. And another thing, at least for me, even for my own company, I look at it is, I think, willingness to change, meaning that I'm sure there will be design changes, there will be manufacturing changes and things like that. How willing they are, how flexible they are to deal with changes. Because some of the companies, they are probably very good at making millions of something, but they're not very good at cope with ECNs, engineering
Yeah,
change requests and things like that. So I think that's really very important for small to medium volume of products and how we choose vendors. Another thing I would look at is I feel is the quality mentality, because a lot of people or a lot of companies are probably making the same thing or serving different customers. But also just to have this quality mentality, what's their quality plan? What's the testing plan? What kind of fixtures that they're using? Are they really paying attention to details? Or are they coachable to really train them to be attentive to the details? So I think the quality is sometimes it could be make it or break it, because anybody can make say something, make an iPhone, but not every company will produce the same quality.
yeah,
Even product may look the same, right?
sure.
So I felt like that's those are the few things that maybe I felt like that's super important to the success. I'm sure there are many more when it comes to evaluation of a supplier.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. I love you. This is amazing. The in-depth practicality of what you're just saying is so useful. I'm giddy right now at how great of an answer that was. So, absolutely excellent points. I like to take notes while I'm listening, and I think one of the things that you mentioned that really hit home for me is willingness to change, which I feel like not a lot of people think about when going into discussions with suppliers. Specifically, it also really depends on what you are getting from the supplier. It, like, really does depend on that. If you are getting, say, a raw material and they have dials that they can play with that changes, like, the chemical composition or the stiffness or something like that, like getting steel extrusions, say, that might be quite easy. That might be a really easy but which is engineering change order for those who might have not heard of the acronym. But I think if you are working with a supplier that's building an equipment for you, you also need to know what their margins are potentially, just know how much money they're gonna make out of it, and every single ECO ends up delaying when they can get paid because
Mhm,
usually payment terms are milestone based, and even the structure of your contracts and the nature of what they're building for you can
mhm,
affect the change willingness to change character of a supplier. But then also there is, like, the inherent character of the supplier where some of them just want to have very robust requirements. They
mhm,
will make it to the T, but they do not want to hear from you ever again.
mhm,
And that is such a critical component that a lot of people just assume that suppliers will be willing to make changes because you're like, "I'll pay for it. It'll extend my timeline. It'll be fine." But it doesn't work that way because they're working with multiple people and you're a Tetris in their Gantt chart in their project life cycle. So
mhm,
I think is such a good call out. I fully agree with you on the project management side. I think that is one of the harder things to evaluate because it's rainbows and butterflies in the beginning with your sales rep and they give you like an account manager and they're painting this beautiful picture, but then actual tracking of your project and actual tracking of your manufacturing, that can be pretty dicey. So looking into how they're presenting it and how they intend to track and how they're going to report to you and all of that stuff. I've been a program manager, so I personally appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think those are super critical. I really feel I'm glad like we share the same perspectives, many things like the project management. I cannot emphasize enough how critical it is. Like to me, building hardware products are extremely challenging, extremely difficult. Project management in terms of managing the resources, managing the communication, managing the timeline, managing the documentations, those are extremely critical to the end success. And also, I think as you're talking about willingness to change, I also there one more thing actually came to my mind.
Hmm.
I want to mention because I feel like that's also important to consider, which is willingness to share. Because a lot of
Mhm.
times we want to make sure the supplier is willing to share their cost structure, willing to share some best practices in terms of probably material selection or manufacturing processes and things like that. Because more than times, like we rely on suppliers' know-how They
Mm,
make that's a sort of their how they make a living. They better know more than I do in terms of how to make that machine or something like that. So
mhm,
I feel like a willingness to transparency is also very important. If we give them a cost structure spreadsheet that they are willing to fill it out to tell us, okay, this is how much material we'll need for each step, and this is the cycle time, this is the yield, this is whether or not whatever the residue materials can be reused or recycled so they can recoup some of the money and then not just claim a 30% of yield loss or anything. So I
mhm,
feel like those are very important. And also you touch on the technology and part of that. I feel like the respect for NDA agreement, that's
mm.
also important, non-disclosure agreement, because I have to say there are times like I visited a supplier, ask her for some questions, and immediately the supplier start talking about another client and how they solve the problem or how the
Mm.
other client solved the problem and things like that. Then
Right.
that become a red flag to me because I feel like if they can talk about other clients openly,
They'll talk
with
about
me
you.
for my very first visit, I'm sure they probably will talk about my project at some point with other clients. So
Mhm.
anyway, so those are things I think are also important to mention.
I have a edge case question for you, and feel free to, if you don't have an opinion on it, that's totally okay. But I've seen a few times now where there are these suppliers that do end to end turnkey solutions for startups, where a startup has this IP or idea. And they go to a supplier, and that supplier has potentially done something of a variation of it for years, but there is innovation on it, basically. There is IP that people own. And they go to a supplier and say, "Could you build me this innovative version of something that you've done before?"
Mhm,
However, so there's this issue that arises. It's interesting, a conflict of interest that arises
mhm,
where the startup itself could potentially in the future in-house manufacture this. But because of this kind of early stage of it, they are going to a supplier and they're outsourcing it, them to become like an inherent competitor,
mhm,
if that makes sense. Have you ever
mhm.
had to navigate something like that, and how do you do that?
Question. Yeah, I think you can definitely see how that happens and if there's any sort of workaround or anything. I feel it really depends on what the business strategy is. Because in a sense, I think that's back to the outsource and in-house question.
Mhm,
Because normally, in a sense, if it is a more efficient and well, cost efficient and also logistically it makes sense, I would say normally people would choose to do outsource rather than in-house because people
mhm.
would be willing to focus their time and energy on selling rather than making.
Yeah.
So that's one point. So when you say there's a potential opportunity for the company to do a similar version in-house, then I probably would first question whether that will be the case if they have already found a vendor that capable of doing that and they can scale.
Mhm,
Uh, so that's one thing I want to mention. And the secondly, I also feel if the vendor has capability of doing something, but it's a an improved version of something that they have been doing, then I would say I have to say there always a risk in terms of the vendor will pick up that technology and build that into their future product.
mm,
Because we cannot just rely on the NDA, even though I just mentioned I said respected for NDA. But the
mhm,
other side, I don't feel like purely rely on the A is gonna the work in the long run.
mm,
Because it's even like the IP, people say, hey, I patent this, I have an IP on this. But I think we all know that the IP is to protect. But on the other side, how much time people would have to fight over this.
mhm,
So I feel like if there's a risk and it's too obvious that the supplier may copy the technology and take it with them and become a competitor, then I would say just don't go with them because that's just a too much
It's
probably
actually
headache down the road.
That makes a ton of sense. So, thank you for exploring my edge case weird scenario. I'm just curious because it has come up a few times, and I maybe it's not as much as of an edge case. It seemed to have happened to you even with insights into materials and vendors not being able to share that. So I'm sure that it happens to a lot of people. So going back on just traditional outsourcing and insourcing, what are some common pitfalls you've seen startups do when they're trying to set up their supply chain, and how do you feel like they can avoid them?
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a very challenging and a tricky question because I've seen not only startups, but also even, I would say, with a lot of resources, could bet on something that may not yield the result they're looking for. The way how I look at this is, again, it becomes a matter of, I feel like, uh, when we're building supply chain, when we're looking at the supply chain as a whole, it becomes a matter of, are we thinking too far ahead
Mm,
or not far ahead enough?
mhm,
So, because it really depends on, as I said, the stage of the company, the stage of the development, the stage of the product, and also even the stage of the market, whether or not the market is mature enough to take the product or not.
mm,
That people need to educate the customers, or this is just a replacement of an existing product. So people, there's a demand for it already, but just
mm,
need a different version or improvement version of something. So I
mhm,
think what I mean is, it's really a matter of, we talk about so many different factors when we're looking at a supply chain, but then I think I have a clear assessment of where we are is super critical, because people may choose something like, say, 3 or 5 years down the road. I really want to see how this product become millions of the product at the end of the day, but they haven't even built 100 yet.
yeah,
Versus they have already built 1,000, but they haven't thought about what's next for them.
mhm,
So I feel like there are definitely, people definitely need to strike a balance in terms of what's good enough, in terms of cost, the quality. But at the other side, it becomes a matter of the whether or not the partner is a long-term partner, even if they have already made tens of thousands, but are they able to make tens of million? Or when they're, and what's the switch cost? Whether or
mm,
not bet on a wrong supplier, then if we switch to a different supplier, what it takes to get there. So I think, yeah, so we'll say like pitfalls, I feel it's vary from case to case, but on the other side, I'm a very sort of a matrix framework person. Develop your own framework and matrix. Really understand, out of a zillion things probably on your list, what are the top 3 and top 5 things you think that's super critical to the success of the supply chain, to the success of the product, to the success of the company? So I feel like we all need to be very objective driven. So if those are things like aligned with the company, the supply chain goals are aligned with the company goals, then that's good. Because even at each stage, you need to align those goals and not have a mismatch. Yeah, so I think, yeah, I think set up the goals and really understand where you are with the strength and the weakness of each supplier you're betting on. And I think those are probably more important than many other things I
mhm.
couldn't put on the list.
That makes sense. And we talked a little bit about expanding into kind of the global supply chain. And I really want to pick your brain on that because that's something that you've actively worked on for years and you continue to go and visit and build insight into that. So, in your mind, knowing that most of our listeners are hardware entrepreneurs that are working on many different systems, from consumer products to industrial systems utilizing plastics, metal, in large aspect ratios and form factors to small, would you be able to just recite industry specific examples of where folks could find certain things and what the, I guess, in global supply chain, what the strengths of suppliers are in different regions? Because I
Mhm.
don't think that's super common. I know textiles are great in Turkey, but that's that would be one example. I'm sure that you have many more.
Yeah, actually, that's a very interesting question. Because from my past experience, I primarily focus on Asia. And then after Apple, actually, I started exploring different vendor. Like even when I was at Apple, like I primarily focus on the mechanical and the system level components and the vendors. But after that, I started looking at for my own company equipment and the raw materials and
Mm,
things like that. So I look at a lot of European companies and and companies in Brazil and in US and Canada. So the way how I look at this is, I really feel they're probably supply chain, to my knowledge, every country in every region. In terms of, we say, fabrics or plastic injection or rubber or bio-based material or flex cables or motherboards and all things, all kinds of things. I feel there's definitely a regional and a local supply chain in most areas.
Yeah.
And what makes a difference is I feel becomes a matter of the business owner's personal relationship and the preferences, and also becomes a matter of, as we talk about the project management, the cost, the quality, and things like that.
Mhm.
And I will start with, I feel like a lot of times, as I said, I feel like the trust is very important. It
Mhm.
becomes a matter of whether or not the owner of the business has developed the trust over certain supply chain, some regions and areas.
Mhm.
So for instance, like for me, I probably could find a vendor of pretty much anything in China. That's
Mhm.
I spend so much time there developing supply chain myself, and I have so many networks there. So I know what the boundaries are, what the suppliers in China can do, or where I need to push them to improve, I have to say.
Mhm.
But on the other side, I feel like in India, Vietnam, Taiwan, even Korea and Japan, there are many quality vendors in those regions as well. When it comes to, say, plastic injection or build a motherboard or even electronic system or testers and things like that.
Mhm.
I feel, as I said, and also you mentioned this, like the turnkey, the one-stop shopping solution.
Yeah.
I think one probably specific things I want the business owner to consider is whether or not it makes sense for them to start with a turnkey solution when the company is small, and then start building their own supply chain after that. The reason why I'm saying that is because for a small company, say they only have 20 people or even 10 people, sometimes it will be hard to source every single component all by themselves. They
Mm.
can source the critical ones, but it will be easier to have a turnkey vendor to help them based on their vendor database and the know-how or even the scale, the
Mhm.
volume of the product that they buy. It may be cheaper. A lot of people say, even in the past, I have encountered the issue. People say, "Hey, for the resistor capacitors, if we buy it from the retail market, it's a lot more expensive than electronic OEM. They buy for every single customer, and then they buy in volume, so it's a lot of cheaper there."
Mhm.
So back to your question about the industry where the specific items from each country, I have to say, I probably would not give a matrix that say, hey, you buy this wood from this particular region. I'm sure people will find the quality wood and also their different specs. Like now I'm in the plant fiber business. I know like each type of fiber has different characteristics, physical characteristics. So I wouldn't be as specific as that. But on the other side, I would just say build the network and then
Mhm.
build that kind of trust, because normally people will be able to find components from each region. But what make a difference is the cost, the quality, the willingness to change, as what we said. I think those are more important probably than the regional question.
And in your mind, if there are startups that haven't had networks or experience in diving into vendors in Asia or specifically China, do you have any resources or how they can do that? Because feel like for some it feels like a black box at times.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing. Like for, as I said, a lot of cases, if people just started doing their own sort of passion project, they want to really do a hardware project, then they can always start from local. So look at what's really in the region, even that's in
Yeah.
US. I know there are like manufacturing facilities here to do
So many.
motherboard, to
Mhm.
do, yeah, injection molding, to do sheet metal and things like that, to do even anodizing. So I feel like maybe start from local to begin with to test and prove the concept. And then once they get into all this supply chain and the industry, they will start building their network. And also they will know more names. But of course, I know there are turnkey solutions in the US, basically in the US or basically in Asia. So if they could find one of those companies, probably will make it a little bit easier.
Mm.
And of course, I wouldn't say I'm readily available, but I'm willing to help. If anyone has any particular questions, feel free to find me on LinkedIn. I'll be happy to give some referrals or answer some questions.
Excellent. And when going into supplier selection, we talked about all of the metrics that you mentioned around their ability to hit project management targets, where it's schedule, cost, their quality, culture, their just in general, how many examples they can give of the work that they've done, and so on and so forth. How do you go in your mind? How do you go around selecting the correct sized supplier? Because if you're a super small company and you're going for the big boy suppliers, then you might not have a great chance. And the relationship key elements that you mentioned start to change a little bit because they might be more willing to make changes for big clients, but not so much for small clients. How do you select the correct size? And how do you have a rule of thumb of just you should be making up, I don't know, some percentage of their revenue to make it make sense?
Yeah, that's a tough question, I have to say. I feel they're probably hard to give a perfect answer.
Mhm.
But the way how I look at this is there are a few things I normally would take into consideration. Number one is, as I said, is a lot of this business relationships are based on trust. So definitely build and expand the network is very important. Get referrals is almost get do the fundraising. A lot of times is really based on the referrals and the friends of friends and the colleagues of colleagues. So I think that that's really important. I'm sure for those people who are doing hardware, particularly in the startup world, their idea is not coming out of nowhere. They probably have done that in their previous career where they have seen other people doing it, and so I feel like it's super important to get ready for the supply chain challenge even before the company. I feel the supply chain needs to be part of the consideration even from the very beginning, from day one. In terms of choosing the right size supplier, as I said, one is the network and the referrals, and secondly is it becomes a matter of when you look at the revenue or not. I think it's become a matter. I probably would more looking at um, sort of the know-how and the strength, because a lot of times, like the supplier may also be interested in working on interesting, like on a innovative project to improve their knowledge and skill because there are so many with some printers, for instance, and they're I wouldn't say so tired of doing the same thing every day. This
Mhm.
is their money maker. But the other side, they're really looking to see and they wanted to have a change as well.
Right.
So I think it really it's a little bit like the storytelling part of the entrepreneurship or the company.
Mhm.
Provide that vision, share the roadmap, and then let them understand how this product will make a big impact in the industry. So I think get that kind of passion aligned is also important sometimes to motivate the supplier. I understand. I think the underlying challenge you mentioned is, hey, I like this supplier, but I'm too small to this supplier. How I
Yeah.
can have them develop interest in me, and then we can work together.
Mhm.
So really depend. Also, as I said, it is a matchmaking in terms of the vision, in terms of the passion for innovation and things like that. I think
Mhm.
try to sell it not only from, hey, I can only cut a PO for $10,000 this time. That's a little bit too transactional. I think painted a rosy roadmap and a picture after the first launch or something. I think that's equally important.
Mhm. Yeah, from what I understand, if it's a potentially larger supplier, they still might have reason to work with you because it would expand their portfolio and and I do see a lot of appetite in recent suppliers of we want to expand to startups, we want to do new things. We've basically gotten really good at this and any improvement that we do in our current kind of technology portfolio is just small percentages. Whereas there's other markets that are emerging and they want to be a part of that shift. And startups actually play a really critical game of also educating suppliers in that and having them develop those skills. So that becomes a strength in going into that conversation. So that's a good point. When it comes to setting up payment structures, Do you have any kind of rules of thumb that you've used that have come in handy and provide a little bit more leverage than a normal kind of payment term would?
Mm. Yeah. Basically, I think that normally when the startups or any companies are working with a new supplier, the first couple of transactions more likely like a prepayment. People want to get cash first before they ship the product.
Yeah.
Uh, so that's the expectation from the supplier. And then after that, I felt when people talk about like sales agreement or service agreement, they also need to set up the expectation like maybe after the first transaction it will become like 9:30 or best of be 9:45. Yeah, so I think that's normal in terms of just setting an expectation even before the very first shipment. Because of the supplier definitely understand they're get very used to having a payment term. All I want to say is even for startups, don't be shy of asking for a payment term and say, hey, let's do 9:45 to begin with, or even 9:60 and then negotiate down. So that's very important because I always have felt, even for startups where they're working with large companies, people may feel like the startups are at a disadvantage for many things. But
Mhm.
the way how I look at this is a startup, we own the IP, we have very innovative sort of ideas. So the relationship should start from where uh, equally important
Mm.
between the supplier and the startup. So let's not first consider, hey, I don't really have too much money and I only have three people working on this. And
Mhm.
believe it or not, even for large companies like I worked for before, for some of the new projects, there are only a very limited handful of people on a
Mhm.
single project. So
Right.
it's by itself, it's a startup, right? So it's a luxury even for large companies to have 20 people work on a new product from day one. So I feel the startup owners should not be shy asking for favorable terms for
Mhm.
volume reductions and inventory management, storage, or something like that. And then how it goes, right? Just to set an expectation. But if people don't ask, it probably will never happen.
Exactly. That's such a good point. I feel like there is this shyness that comes with not knowing potentially and not wanting to piss a supplier off. And there's a way to do it. There's a respectful way of explaining, and you said it really well, of just like the storyline. It's just like we're trying to make this happen by this time and we just raised this round. We are like more than happy to pay this, but in order to do that, we are a startup and we want to keep it lean. And is there any way that you could do these favorable terms? And that's how negotiations begin. You go to what would be ideal for you, and they will tell you what would be ideal for them. And those will usually be in the polar opposite zones of what an agreement can be. And then you meet in the middle. And that's common practice.
Mm.
So I think that word of encouragement of just you can ask, they can say no. And then you can go and ask another supplier, and they might say yes. And so it goes. I think that's great. Before we go into our podcast break, where I'm going to ask you about a hardware horror story or multiple if you want to share, I do want to dive into a little bit of how you went from this like kind of low quantity to high quantity production at Apple, because I'm sure that a lot of our listeners would love to know the journey that took. I'm sure it's maybe even a podcast episode of its own, but I'm curious how that was.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Get all my good old days back and remind me all my days and nights in the factories. Yeah, I felt skill has never been easy. I've been fortunate to witness and also be part of this Apple supply chain expansion. So when I arrived in China back in 2000, literally there, as I said, there was no employee, no office in China, and then only small factories, probably doing some second tier components or something like second tier suppliers in China. And I really felt if we're talking about from low quality, is low quantity to high quantity, it's a probably the way I look at this is probably similar to anything we're trying to do in terms of the scale, because I really felt the key is people.
Mm,
um, so really get the right people on the team and also help people to understand the goals and objectives, understand the, like in the Apple case is Apple culture and the criteria, the way how Apple thinks. Sometimes they're very different from other suppliers. where other brands, I have to say, is super critical. So in my early days, I spent a lot of time just hiring and interviewing people. I probably, during my 3.5 years working in China, I probably interviewed over 6,000 people or something,
Oh,
or
wow.
well, sorry, 6,000 resumes and over probably 600 people at minimum.
Wow.
Yeah, so there were just so many things like we need to go through for on the people side.
Mhm,
Um, and then also in terms of scale, I felt the attention to detail, what kind of equipment and then what kind of fixture, what kind of testers, the test program, the
mhm,
SOPs, the quality inspection plan and the criteria, whether or not they have the right tools, even the right lighting when it comes to quality inspection. And this is to say, I always put the safety and environment as a highest priority when it comes to manufacturing safety environment, how they do with water management, how they do the solid waste, and then how they deal with their packaging material, even. So
mhm,
those are very important. And also, if we're talking about really how we'll be able to ensure all the things like we just talk about the machining, equipment, process, quality, even environment and safety will be executed to the plan. I think another thing very important is we need to have people on the ground in the factory. So with the pair of eyes and the mindset from the client perspective,
mhm,
because a lot of times we may receive a report from the factory and say, hey, the yield is 99.9%.
mhm,
But then when you're really there, you found, oh, they're not really using the right lighting, we're not using the right tester, where
mm,
the software program has already been outdated, had never been updated, and things like that.
mhm,
Uh, so I feel like at some point, even for startup, it is critical to find some affiliation, not directly related to the supplier, hire quality people on the ground or PM on the ground, or even share somebody from another company or something if they can find. I know there's this kind of companies that are providing services.
mhm,
But I think it's critical to use third party perspective to look at the situation.
mhm,
And also, I feel like when it comes to scale, if you're thinking about have a one production line and then scale to 50 production lines, hopefully every single startup will face that challenge at some point. That means that their products are really successful. I think it becomes a matter of practice makes perfect
mhm,
because qualifying one line and scale it to 50 lines are not exactly the same scale.
mhm,
Finding 200 people working on one assembly line versus finding 10,000 people can repeatedly doing the same thing over a course of 250 days in a year are different challenges, I have to say. So I feel like those are my good old days, I have to say, and a lot of stories and a lot of experiences. But in the day, as I said, I think what really makes things happen is really people. I think it always start with finding the right people, training them, talk to them, communicate, regardless of supplier or third party inspector or your own employees. I think that's really important.
That's excellent, and I do see your point. Specifically, the highlight and emphasis you're putting on quality makes a lot of sense to me, and it's very obvious to me. I just want to add a note to it is that what quality sometimes quality is an afterthought
Mm,
because it's something that a lot of people say, "Oh, we'll put quality checks at the end of manufacturing. We'll do this, we'll do that." But that's and the reason I feel like that happens is because sometimes people don't understand the tie of what quality actually means in practice. And I think one of the most important things is quality, obviously, number one, gives you confidence around the performance of your product. That's like the most obvious one. Second, it provides brand integrity, which is super important, specifically as a startup, because I always say to all of the startups I work with is that you're building a company, a product, and a reputation all at the same time. Quality really contributes to the reputation and product side of things. And then third is that I think with you mentioned this with yield, for example, that's a really clear tie into your unit economics.
mhm,
Because if you have poor yield, you're still paying for that time
mhm,
on the manufacturing floor. They're just basically are not able to promise you that all of the products off the line are going to work. So improving that through proper quality implementations and checking and tracking will also improve your further down the line downstream unit economics, techno economics, and even just like sales pipeline and who you sell to. So they're all, in my mind, they're all systematically connected to each other, even though it might not be inherently obvious. So I greatly appreciate your emphasis on that.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I love this podcast. I really love it because, to be honest with you, I've been on some interviews and people ask me questions, but never to the depth as what you have asked. I feel like you demonstrated a great understanding of manufacturing and hardware, and you understand the startup. That's great. I love you emphasize on the quality because I cannot agree more.
Mhm,
Because I feel like, particularly for hardware, if people only make mediocre products, and then even that's a very innovative idea, it's not going anywhere. I think the
mhm,
quality has always been the number one thing, like any of the startup to think about. That's the competitive edge, even before the innovative idea. People can make something happen, but if it doesn't really last, it doesn't really perform the function that the customer would expect it to perform,
mhm,
then I would not call it a success. But back to the quality thing, you're absolutely right. But one thing actually that remind me, I always like to mention some other occasions I call it design for quality. Because I think
mm,
you said it could be an aftermath type of thing, but the reality is actually quality need to be prioritized and considered from day one. So when
mm,
people start doing the product design, they need to think about how this product will be tested, and also what's the sort of the lifespan of the product. And also there will be a lot of, they call it DFIMA. It's like a design for failure analysis. It's a matter of how people will use it and how the product will fail.
yep,
So there's a lot of aspect people need to take into consideration when it comes to quality. And then also, so there the design quality, there's an incoming raw materials quality,
yep,
they're called the IPQC, the in-process quality, and then the OQC, the outgoing quality, and then there's a reliability, right? There's a reliability test. There's so many different aspects that people need to take into consideration when it comes to quality. And this to say, I always emphasize on people, but throughout the quality management process, just to train the inspectors, to train the quality engineers to understand the criteria.
mhm,
That's also very important because I also see their companies develop perfect quality plan. Everything is in blueprint. It's a 20-page document, but
yep,
nobody reads it. When it comes to factory, they're still using their own sort of criteria where they feel like they understand, but they don't really understand. They're
yeah,
and then thinking about the operators online, how they use this 20-page, particularly if that's in English, how they use that document to do their day-to-day job. So I think there are a lot of details that need to be checked. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely.
This episode and podcast are brought to you by my consulting company, Pratik Development, where every startup receives a tailored approach in transitioning their ideas or research to an innovative hardware product. I'm dedicated to helping with strategic execution, product development, scaling manufacturing, and optimizing supply chains to bring your vision to life. I believe that hardware should be accessible and successful, and that's the whole reason that the podcast exists. So if you value the podcast and you'd like the episodes and you appreciate the insights, please support us by sharing, rating, and leaving a review at your favorite podcast platform. Your engagement is crucial in helping us reach more visionaries like yourself. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the community.
With that, I do want to go into our fun podcast break to hear about some hardware horror stories that you would be willing to share because I feel like those are one, the most fun to listen to. And also, you learn so much from failures. I feel like there's always case studies on successes. I like to flip it on the head and say, what did you fail at? And, or what did you see someone else fail at? And how can we all learn from that?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. Thank you for that question. That's probably the most challenging question on this product so far because I feel like I've seen so many hardware startups, and I'm actually working on one myself. Uh, there, a lot of things could go wrong, particularly it comes to hardware. And also, as I mentioned, I did a software startup prior to this one. And I feel like software is when you make a mistake in coding is a lot easier to correct and then test
Right.
and much faster than doing that for a hardware product.
Mhm.
Um, but I think what makes this a little bit challenging is I don't want to give too many specifics so then people know which company I'm talking about. And so,
Sure.
let me make it, I hope you don't mind, let me make this a little bit more generic.
Sure, go for it.
Really, I think for horror stories, I like that. I think I really feel like for the hardware company, one of the very important thing is to really understand the market.
Mm.
I even see, for instance, like I'm in the packaging business. I don't think that like I would even call myself the expert in everything that the packaging industry does. But sometimes I found maybe somebody who is a material scientist and thinking, okay, this material can be used for packaging, but this person has very little knowledge about how packaging industry or even packaging work.
Mm.
Um, so I think that could become a potential issue because I do see some of the companies are struggling to find customers.
Mm.
Simply, they don't really understand the market. They thought the material can be useful for packaging, but then that's not the way how the packaging works.
Mm.
Um, so I think yeah, just to really have that kind of experience or a clear path to the market is extremely important
Mhm.
because a lot of times the people normally take it for granted and say, hey, I know there's a market for this, but the reality is the way it is, that there's a reason for the way it is today. And when people want to change it, they definitely need to understand what's the pain point and what motivate people to change it. It's
Mhm.
not just a marginal improvement will flip the coin.
Mhm.
Uh, so I think that market fit is one thing. Like I often see the startup fail. I do have a few examples, but as I mentioned, I think I won't name them, but I feel that's one thing.
Mm.
And secondly, I feel like people become overconfident in their technology.
Mm.
I also have experienced in the past. There could be a PhD from a very prestigious university where somebody they feel like they have the technology and then they can really market it or materialize it. But when it comes to manufacturing, a lab work is very different from the work in the manufacturing environment. So people feel like if they can do 0 to 1, then they can do 1 to 1 million. I think that's a wrong sort of perception because there's so many different things that, as we have already discussed over this podcast, I think people need to take into consideration. So even if they demonstrate that they can do 1 or 10 of those, how to make them consistently in the same quality at a cost that can be accepted by the market
Mm.
is a completely different challenge.
Mm.
So I feel like people normally underestimated the challenge of turning a technology into a hardware product and
Mm.
the scale from there.
Mm.
So I think that's another thing I've seen. And then the third one, and I'll stop there after the third one, which is people do their fundraising in order to probably generate the concept, the proof of concept product or some initial samples. But then they did not really leave much room for errors. For hardware, I have to say, I've never seen a hardware product that hit hit the market with their first round of delivery. There will be iterations of changes and modifications in order to make it even sellable. So I
Mhm.
feel like people definitely need to budget and take the errors into consideration and then leave a little bit runway for the changes.
Mm.
So I think those are the three things: that the market fit, the lab to factory transition, and also leave room for errors. I think those are the three things I would say that would haunt me probably in my nightmare if I didn't do it right. But I've seen some failures from other.
In those areas. That was such a, academic approach to to the hardware horror stories. I like it. It's on the meta side of what could cause a hardware horror. And so I do appreciate that, and I definitely have seen that happen, and also, I think, like, when you launch something into the market, If it's working absolutely perfectly, it means that you probably waited too long because even if something works perfectly, it doesn't mean that it's going to be received that way, especially if it's a consumer product. And users always change the game. And so getting that feedback early on is always something that comes up on this podcast all the time with
Mm.
most of my guests. Diving right back into the questions as we near the edge of the end of the podcast. So, often, the most often forgotten or not even a metric at all in manufacturing is sustainability. And unfortunately, because everyone's trying to get product as quickly out as possible, this metric doesn't even make it to spreadsheets. It doesn't even make it to conversations at times. In your mind, how can startups or even bigger companies do their part to make manufacturing more sustainable?
Mhm. Yeah. Um, well, thank you for mentioning that. That's my passion right now, and I can see this for the foreseeable future because I really, like you said, when I was working more in a manufacturing environment, it wasn't the first priority 20 years ago when I started my career. Because people always just wanted to make it fast and make it even the quality and then make it the function work well. But now I think when we look at the climate change crisis, when we look at the plastic pollution crisis, people start realizing, oh, we need to do things differently and then take sustainability as part of the metric. Yeah, so there are a few things I think from my side. This is where I can share my experience, and I feel what we do as a startup. And I know for big companies, even like Apple, they do this as well because again, back to the design of the product, the concept of product. So, like for me, my company, we always advocate for plastic-free products. At the stage of material selection, we're looking at a wide range of materials that doesn't really contains plastic, like a petroleum-based ingredients. So that's the material side, and then the manufacturing side, and then that's the functional side. So we look at sort of the product from both ends, from the end user, how the user will use it, and then also from the perspective of what kind of technology and the materials that we can utilize to scale
Mhm.
as well. So I think to me, if I may, I'll just use one of the product that like we're making. So it's a tape product, and with actually it's a cellulose tape, and then with a molded fiber dispenser.
Mhm.
And so the whole product is plastic free, and people after they use it, they can either refill it, change the tape, or they can throw this into the recycle bin. This is basically a recyclable paper product. So I think, but the whole concept is, I think there one thing we pay attention to. One is we call it less is more. So how can we use fewer materials, like fewer ingredients, like a number of materials, and also in terms of the volumetric efficiency, keep the product smaller, and also when it comes to manufacturing, how we can reduce the number of steps in the manufacturing, keep it simple because when it comes to carbon emission and waste material treatment, really we're looking at from both ends how we can use less to
Mhm.
generate more.
Mhm.
And then secondly, I think a very important when it comes to sustainability is I call it design for end of life.
Mm.
So it becomes a matter of how people dispose it, whether or not any of the product or any part of the product or even the packaging can be will be any part of the waste stream that can be
Mm.
utilized in the circular economy. So I think design for end of life is very important. And from my side, I always encourage people, or just like how we do at my own company, to prioritize the biomass because
Mm.
we have a slogan within our company called "From Nature to Nature." So we want that to use renewable materials, and then this can circle back into the economy, or eventually even get down to the kind of the soil where it's biodegradable or compostable or recyclable with paper. Those are sort of the criteria we use for kind of material selection and design for end of life. Yeah. Yeah. Very good question. And I think a lot of companies now started looking at their ESG goals in terms of carbon emission, carbon neutrality, waste treatment, and things like that. So I'm very happy to see that trend. Yeah.
Is this something that when you are buying from a supplier, because I still haven't yet to come across this, I wish that it existed, but is this something that we can expect that suppliers will give the option to? Because I feel like when it comes to packaging, it's this untalked of part of any procurement process where
Mhm,
it's like the packaging just comes and
mhm,
it's like we do packaging, usually it's plastic, usually it's a lot of plastic. And do you feel like is your company also trying to tackle that and maybe be like an add-on service to suppliers of just like, you can pay like 25% more for packaging, which maybe like you're purchasing something that's, I don't know, $300,000 and the
mhm,
packaging is going to be like $3,000, but if you
mhm,
pay $4,000, then it could be completely plastic free or something like that. Do you feel like that is going to be a part of the conversation when it comes to supply chain? Or is that like a future that you wanna see? And is it active right now? I'm not sure.
mhm. Yeah, very good question. Very good. Actually, I have to say I have very similar experience when it comes to asking a supplier to provide packaging, or even you ask an OEM to do the whole turnkey solution. They will just grab and go with whatever readily available and whatever sort of cheap enough for them to make a profit. Right. Because normally, like even before I started my packaging company, I felt like a packaging that has never been on my radar screen as an issue. Like it's always readily available regardless of what. But when I really peel off the supply chain, I was definitely appalled by just looking at, I was just surprised to see how much sort of pollution is generated and how much sort of carbon emission probably involved, which is normally have been ignored by many people. Back to the question, yeah, I think for us, like my company, we're doing plastic-free packaging. It's all plant fiber, but we do functional packaging in terms of like protective film and things like that. And also we do expanded fiber foam. And we have actually a series of other protective materials, like all made of plant fibers and non-woven material, molded fiber material, and things like that.
Mhm,
So for us, we're more like a turnkey for we call the sustainable fiber-based packaging solutions.
mhm,
And yeah, I think I think question earlier you mentioned that when you ask a supplier, they probably don't normally first offer any of the sustainable solutions. But to me, I felt like it becomes a matter of you need to ask. You
mm,
really need to demand, say, hey, I want the plastic free packaging. Can you find alternatives? So I think that's super important when it comes to ask Turkey to provide a total solution.
mhm,
And also to your point about, hey, the cost. Yeah, I think for us, we try to make it cost effective and cost equal to the current plastic based packaging solutions, for instance.
mhm.
But because of the scale is not there, there
Yep.
definitely is a premium on top of that. But we normally tend to design, as I said, less is more. So we can get rid of few like items in the packaging and make it the total cost of packaging the same as probably some other solutions. Because as you can see, sometimes if you open a box, there's so many different bags, and so many different tapes, and
Yeah, it's
so many
not
different
necessary.
things. Yeah, and they're probably not necessary. Even we keep the design clean, and then we only use the structural material where it needs to be, and the
Mhm,
protective material where it needs to be, then the total cost shouldn't be higher than what it is today.
mhm, mhm. Okay, that makes sense. In that case, as we close off the episode, I usually ask my guests to provide like last parting words and advice to hardware entrepreneurs, just like words of affirmation and encouragement as they're embarking on a difficult journey, but such a rewarding one.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think first of all, I want to say congratulations to those hardware entrepreneurs. I definitely admire your passion and the courage to even start the journey
Mm,
because from my past experience, I found like it could be super, super challenging as it has more sort of dimensions that need to be taken into consideration. There's so many trade-offs that need to be made throughout the process. But on the other side, I firmly believe I look at many things on the AI, on the software side, but I also look at so many things on the hardware side.
Mhm.
I really felt for us to make the life easier and more sustainable for future generations that we cannot get away from hardware, regardless
Mhm.
computer, regardless is even a TV or phone, or like what I'm doing right now, even a tape and dispenser,
Mhm.
we cannot get away from those.
Mhm.
But I think what's more important is really team up with the right people, team up with the people who can complement your skill sets and experiences, turn your dream, turn your ideas into a technology, scalable technology and a scalable product. And I think that's very important. So I cannot emphasize enough on the people side.
Mm.
And then secondly is I also feel like when it comes to manufacturing, always start with something like manageable. I love the concept of MVP. It's a minimal variable product. So don't try to have all the features in one product. It's just too challenging to build everything. So have really keep it simple,
Mhm.
and also cost competitive is something need to be designed for from day one. Yeah, I think to me, yeah, for any of this, if people have questions, as I mentioned, find me on LinkedIn, send me questions. I'll be happy to give you some referrals from my network. And if people have questions about the packaging, I'll be more than happy to answer questions or provide you solutions, particularly from the early stage, because I feel design something right in the first place is easier than make changes later on,
Mm.
because I hope like all the entrepreneurs, you focus on designing and improving your product, and then later you can focus on just selling the product and make millions of those, and that's more important. Yeah, and I truly appreciate Sarah for the opportunity you give me. I honestly did not expect our conversation would be so deep in the hardware development and the supply chain, and I really appreciate all the thoughtful questions you asked. Wonderful job. Thank you.
The responses you gave are going to be dramatically valuable to the entrepreneurs that listen. So thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome to our Too Long Didn't Listen segment, where, as always, I give you the key takeaways of the episode so that you don't have to listen to the entire thing if you don't have the time. And when you do, you can just go back and listen to it and get all of the details and everything that our wonderful guest talked about today. Today, we discuss supply chain management, manufacturing, and sustainability in hardware startups with Ying Liu. It was such a great conversation, and we really dove deep into how to make supply chain decisions, manufacturing decisions, and she was really anchoring off of her experience of building Apple's entire supply chain infrastructure in China. So it was a very valuable conversation. So without further ado, I'm just going to go right into all of the key takeaways and what you need to know. So, we discussed outsourcing versus insourcing. Ying stressed the importance of evaluating your company's stage, product complexity, and available resources when choosing between outsourcing and in house production. She recommended that you start small and local, then consider scaling globally to minimize cost. She emphasized supplier relationships and said establishing a trusting relationship with your suppliers is the key, evaluating them best based on their track record, flexibility, communication skills, and commitment to quality, and told our listeners to see it as a partnership that requires clear expectations and shared goals. So making sure that you set that up from the beginning. Third takeaway was that quality is king. Never compromise on quality. Integrate quality checks throughout your production process to ensure your product meets high standards, which in turn bolsters your brand's reputation and reliability. That's where I came in with the classic saying that I usually do with my clients, which is you're building a company, you're building a product, and you're building a reputation. So quality really integrates with all of those things, and it's important to integrate it and keep it very core to the product development culture. She gave some scaling insights. So, drawing from her Apple experience, Ying emphasized the importance of meticulous planning, quality control, and on ground oversight when scaling production. It's about getting the details right, ensuring safety, and maintaining standards. Then we pivoted into talking about sustainability, and her current passion is regarding sustainable packaging. So she was talking about how to embed sustainability in your manufacturing from the get-go.
opt for renewable materials, design with products' end of life in mind, and strive for minimal waste footprint. This is something that we can all do in all of the daily decisions that we make with our product development. So I think it was a really good call out, and she talked about some actionable ways to do that. She mentioned some just thoughts on financial wisdom. So be prudent with your financial planning. Hardware development can be unpredictable, so allocate resources for unseen changes, iterations to keep your innovation on track without financial strain. And then she ended on making sure that you leverage your community and engage with really great people and really build a people culture. She recommended to engage with other entrepreneurs to seek advice, and don't hesitate to tap into your network for support and collaboration opportunities. So with that, this wraps up our quick recap. Whether you're in deep trenches of hardware development or just curious about the field, these were some insights from Ying. This doesn't even scratch the surface of all of the things that she provided in this episode. So once you have time, please go back and check it out. And with this, before I sign off, I do want to say that I want to take a moment to acknowledge the journey we've been on together. So this episode marks the end of season 2, and it's been incredible, crazy, wonderful, showstopper. I really don't have enough positive adjectives to describe how the energy and feedback I've gotten on the podcast. I really want to thank each and every one of you that's been tuning in, sharing your thoughts, being a part of the community, reaching out to me. I always appreciate the messages I get. So if you're ever too shy, please don't be. I really appreciate it. Your engagement and curiosity and support have made this podcast so incredibly special and bigger than I ever thought it could be. So thank you so much. And yeah, this season, from the in-depth interviews with industry leaders to diving deep into the nuts and bolts of hardware entrepreneurship, we've covered a lot of ground, and there's still a lot. I have a lot of ideas. I have a big mind map going for season 3. So rest assured, I am definitely gearing up. I want to continue doing this, and I'm super open to ideas. So as you share this podcast, like it, comment on it, give feedback on it, please share with me some ideas. I'm always happy to incorporate them into the strategy of the next season. And please don't hesitate to reach out. Until then, I wish you the best of luck with your hardware endeavors. And I hope that the podcast episodes always act as a partner and a whisper in your ear so that you can avoid as many risks and pitfalls as possible and have a super successful hardware development journey. Until the next season, I say goodbye, or more so, see you later. And keep on innovating, keep working on hardware. It's super important. That's the reason we're all here. All right, take it easy. The opinions and information shared on this podcast are for informational purposes only. We always recommend that you seek professional advice before taking any action related to your business or personal ventures.